And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. Thanks for joining for our marine segment for today. Starting off, we'll take a quick summary of some of the weather that's going on. It's going to bring some stronger winds to our areas. We do have a low that's been moving through the Bering, and by Saturday we'll be approaching the west coast of the state, bringing in some concerns of some potential coastal flooding and high surf for areas from the Norton Sound area down through the Kuskokwim Bay area. That will be into Monday morning for most of those locations. A lot of rain with this system as well, and we can see with the tighter isobars behind this low that we will expect some stronger winds with this as well, especially as the front is pushing through. That would be primarily out of a westerly direction, and then we can see out over the Gulf waters more of a southerly flow following behind the warm front here, with maybe some weaker winds on Saturday for the Panhandle. As we move into Sunday and we have another system pushing through the Gulf waters, expecting some winds to pick up in those areas, primarily out of a westerly direction. Our other low out over the Bering is going to have moved into the Seward Peninsula area. Still westerly component to those winds coming onshore to the southwestern portions of the state. Potentially a little bit weaker, but still decently strong compared to some of the other areas that we could see. So looking at the southeast for our Saturday marine forecast, lighter winds as expected, especially in the inside waters, only around 10 knots there. Somewhat of an easterly component as we get out into the Gulf, 10 to 15 knots there. More westerly as we get farther to the north. Then on Sunday, winds picking up as that next system moves into the Gulf area. Southeast winds in the inside waters, 25 knots for the central and northern locations, and then 25 to 30 knots out over the Gulf waters out of the south, becoming east as we get closer towards Yakutat. Saturday for south central Alaska, lighter winds for much of the northern portions of the Gulf, 15 knots out of somewhat of a southeasterly direction here. But for Cook Inlet, going to see more southerly winds, northern areas, 10 knots, picking up to as high as 30 knots as we get to the west of the Barren Islands, and 30 knots on the east side as well. On Sunday, southwesterly winds, the Cook Inlet area up to 25 knots. Out over the Gulf waters, winds picking up in those northern locations as well. Primarily westerly flow here, 25 knots most locations, becoming more northerly as we get east of Cordova. Looking at the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island on Saturday, around the island we have southerly winds, 20 to 30 knots, picking up as we get to the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, up to 35 knots there, and 30 knots out of a southerly direction on the Bering side of the peninsula. Then on Sunday, going to see primarily west to southwest flow for all these areas of the peninsula and Kodiak Island, 25 knots around Kodiak Island, 30 knots on the Bering side of the peninsula, and 20 knots on the Pacific side. So look out over the Aleutian Islands on Saturday, southwesterly winds, 35 knots for the eastern Aleutians, dropping down to 25 to 30 for the central Aleutians, and then 35 knots out of a westerly direction for the western Aleutians. On Sunday, that's going to drop down and become more southerly, 15 to 20 knots for the most part. Some areas could get up to as high as 25 knots. For the central Aleutian Islands, southwesterly winds 20 to 25 knots, and 20 knots out of the southwest for the eastern Aleutians. Along the west coast, we're going to see easterly flow up north out ahead of that low, and we're going to have 30 knots out of the Norton Sound area to size 35 knots on the northern side of Nunavik Island, becoming more southerly as we get south of Nunavik Island, 40 knots by the Kuskokwim Delta area, and 30 knots out by the Pribilof Islands, 25 and out of a southeasterly direction for St. Matthew Island. Then on Sunday, primarily southwest winds for much of the area along the southwest coast. We're going to see 30 knots south of Nunavik Island, 30 to 35 knots on the northern side. Up along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see easterly winds, 10 to 15 knots, becoming stronger, but staying out of the east as we start to drop down the coast, 25 knots as we get closer towards the Bering Strait, and 30 knots just south of the Bering Strait. On Sunday, we're going to still see easterly flow through much of the Arctic coastline down the west coast, 10 to 20 knots up on the northern side, and 20 to 25 knots as we drop down the coastline. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for watching.